If you've just picked up a RED camera and you're coming from a mirrorless body, you're going to notice quickly that things feel a little different here. Not just physically, but also your entire workflow. This video is about getting you familiar with those differences so you're not just capturing footage, but actually using your RED the way it was designed to be used, which is as a cinema tool. Today, I'll be using the Komodo X to demonstrate, but most of what I'm covering applies across the entire RED ecosystem. Whether you're on a V-Raptor or the OG Komodo, the core concepts remain largely the same. Let's start with what makes RED cameras different at the core. At the heart of every RED camera is REDCODE RAW, and this is what defines the system. Unlike most hybrid cameras that capture compressed video formats like H.264, ProRes, or even internal 10-bit files, RED shoots compressed RAW. What that means is that you're capturing all the sensor data, but in a file size that's actually manageable for production. It's like shooting RAW in photography. Parameters like ISO, white balance aren't baked in. They're just metadata, giving you the full flexibility in post. You're working with a digital negative. The beauty is that you can adjust, re-white balance, re-expose your shot without destroying image quality. This is especially powerful when you want flexibility in the grade. Another key thing to understand, RED decouples resolution and compression. That means you can shoot 6K or 8K at varying compression ratios, from high-quality REDCODE HQ to MQ or LQ. You decide how much data you need depending on your shoot. So from the jump, RED asks you to make decisions based on your intent. This isn't a run and gun system with auto everything. It's built for control and for workflows where you want the most latitude out of your images. Now, getting started is RED's menu system. It's deep. It gives you full control, but that comes with some complexity. So if you're new to RED, give yourself some time to explore it. Tap around, read the manual, get familiar with where things live. That learning curve pays off fast once you start shooting. Now, on the Komodo X, all of this is handheld through the top touchscreen or through your external monitor if you've got camera control. Like, for example, I do on my small HD monitor. Keep in mind, camera control is an additional cost. All right, let's walk through some key sections so you can understand what's critical. Project settings define how your footage is captured, compressed, and played back. You'll find options here for sensor frame rate, time base, resolution, and compression. For the most part, you'll only set this once per shoot and only change it if the nature of the shoot shifts. For example, if you need to shoot some slow motion. Now, let's talk about resolution, specifically because this is something a lot of first-time RED shooters overlook. By default, it might feel like you should always shoot in 6K or 8K to maximize detail and flexibility, but there are some valid reasons not to shoot the full sensor resolution. When you switch from 6K full sensor down to 2K, the field of view shrinks. That's because RED doesn't downscale, it crops. You're using less of the sensor, which means your composition changes, and so does your depth of field and lens behavior. This is powerful when used intentionally. You can basically punch in with the same prime lens just by changing resolution. But it also means you need to be careful. Don't switch resolutions mid-scene unless you're accounting for that crop shift. Under codec, you'll choose between HQ, MQ, and LQ. That's your raw compression setting. This impacts data rate but doesn't change the resolution or frame size. I tend to live at MQ for most of my work. It's a great balance between quality and file size, but it depends on the project. Image settings are where you control your ISO, shutter, and white balance. Now, these aren't baked into the RAW file, but they are critical for monitoring, for proxies, and for your general exposure strategy. Let's touch on ISO specifically because this often confuses people coming from other systems. The Komodo X has a base ISO of 800. This is where your sensor is optimized to deliver the cleanest dynamic range, both in highlights and shadows. When you move away from that, say bumping up to 1600, you're digitally shifting the exposure reference point. You'll start to lift the shadows, but your highlights become more vulnerable to clipping. Same thing in the opposite direction. Drop your ISO to 320 and your shadows might look cleaner on the monitor, but you're actually pushing more of your scene into the lower end of the sensor's tonal curve. So even though ISO is metadata, it's important. It determines where your middle gray falls in your preview. Middle gray is essentially the reference point for skin tones, contrast, and overall exposure balance. So it still informs your lighting decisions. Shutter angle, tint, and white balance are all in the same. White balance is the same idea. It's not baked in, but set them accurately to get the most consistent results throughout your shoot and avoiding surprises in post. Monitoring is where you decide how the image is presented, both on your onboard monitor and through any SDI outputs. You can apply different LUTs to each output, so maybe you're monitoring log internally, but send a Rec 709 to the director's monitor. You can customize which overlays show up where. Things like frame guide, false color, zebras, peaking, they can be toggled per output, which is helpful when shooting multicam or just wanting to send a clean feed over to Video Village. System is where you handle behind the scenes management of the camera, firmware, updates, fan settings, date, time, network setup, and black shading collaboration, which we'll dive deeper into a later section. You'll want to keep an eye on your internal sensor temperature, especially on long takes or when shooting in hot conditions. Also, in here is where you'll find the network setup. This is where you'll configure the camera to connect to RED control, whether that's over Wi-Fi or wired connection. So yes, the RED menu system is deep. It's not hard once you know it, but you need time with it. My advice is spend time navigating it, understand what each setting does, and take note what actually affects the image captured versus what's only affecting the preview. I think that's really important. What you're seeing on the monitor doesn't necessarily mean it's affecting the raw image. Next, we're going to break down two of RED's most powerful but underused tools, goalposts and traffic lights. These are designed specifically to help you expose for RAW, and they're unlike anything on most other camera systems. Now, one of the most overlooked features on RED cameras, and honestly one of the most powerful, is the built-in exposure tools called goalposts and traffic lights. These are designed specifically for shooting REDCODE RAW, and they give you much more accurate view of your exposure than what you get with an exposure tool like a histogram. Let's break down what they are, how they work, and why they're essential when exposing for RAW. Let's start with goalpost. You'll see 6 vertical bars on screen, 3 on the bottom for shadows and 3 on the top for highlights. Each bar represents one of the RGB color channels. The higher the highlight bar climbs, the more of that color channel is clipping in the highlights. The lower in the shadow the bar drops, the more of that channel is falling into noise. Each full bar represents about 25% of the pixels in that color channel. For the shadow bars, you can still drop as far as halfway, which is about 12.5% of your image falling into noise, and that's usually still acceptable, especially if you plan to clean it up in post. But with highlights, even a small amount of clipping can be unrecoverable. If one of the highlight bars starts filling, particularly the red channel, you could lose important detail in the skin tone data, and once it's clipped, it's gone. So the general rule is it's safer to underexpose slightly than to risk clipping. You can clean up the noise, you can recover the shadows, but blown highlights can be more permanent and unrecoverable. Now let's talk traffic lights. These are located in the top and bottom corners, 6 little indicators. 3 represent the highlight clipping and 3 represent the shadows. Again, red, green, and blue. If a highlight light turns red, it means more than 2% of that channel is clipped. If a shadow light turns blue, that means more than 2% is falling into noise. While 2% may seem small, it's enough to destroy color accuracy, especially with skin tones. A red channel clipping light might mean your subject's skin is blown out in the channel, even if the rest of the image looks okay. For video, especially on the red channel, it's better to let your shadows go a bit deeper to protect your highlights. You want some cushion because highlight clipping can creep in quickly. That's why exposing to the right, or ETTR, is dangerous on red. It risks sacrificing highlight detail for minimal gains in shadow noise, and the trade-off isn't worth it. Instead, use goalposts to override the edge of your highlight limit without crossing it. Let shadows drop slightly if you needed it, especially if you know you can manage noise in post. Once you get used to these tools, you'll be able to dial in exposure fast and accurately. It'll become second nature. That's the whole point. RED built this system to give you confidence on the sensor level, so you're not guessing based on your LUT or your waveform. Okay, in the next section, we'll dive into RED's most misunderstood processes, but still essential, black shading. What it is, when to do it, and why it's critical for getting clean, consistent images from your sensor. Black shading is one of those things that sound technical, and it kind of is, but once you understand what it's doing, it becomes routine maintenance. Think of it like sensor calibration. It's not something you need to do every day, but when you skip it, you might start to notice a fixed pattern noise, Think of it as like sensor calibration. It's not something you need to do every day, but when you skip it, you might start to notice fixed pattern noise, weird vertical banding, or inconsistent blacks, especially if your camera has gone through extreme temperature shifts. Let me explain what black shading is, why it matters, and when you should do it. Every image sensor, including REDs, has small variation in how individual pixels respond to heat and light. These variations can create a subtle, repeating texture across your image called fixed pattern noise. It's most manageable in the shadows and doesn't just go away by adjusting your exposure or ISO. What black shading does is map that sensor behavior at a specific temperature and exposure setting. It creates a kind of correction profile. RED calls this a calibration map. It uses that profile to subtract the fixed noise from all the future frames. The result is cleaner blacks, more consistent tonal range, and a better overall looking image. Sensors behave differently at different temperatures. If you calibrate a camera in a cold studio, then take it outside in 30 degrees heat, your original calibration map might not hold up. That's why RED recommends reshading whenever you change environments, especially if you're shooting in conditions that are different from the last time the camera was calibrated. Here's how you do it. First, make sure your camera's fully warmed up. You want the internal sensor temperature to be stable, ideally similar to what you'll be during your actual shoot. Let the camera sit powered on for about 15 minutes if needed. Next, put a body cap on the camera. You want complete darkness, no light leaks. On the Komodo X, go to Menu, System, Maintenance, Calibrate, then Sensor Calibration. Hit Calibrate Sensor. The camera will take a few minutes to map the noise and generate a new calibration map. Once that's done, the camera will apply that profile to all future footage. There's no harm in doing this regularly. It won't damage the sensor and it won't mess up your footage. If anything, it just improves consistency. But if you don't do it when you need it, you'll start to see artifacts in the blacks, especially when you're pushing your image in post. You should definitely run a new black shade after a firmware update, after a major change in ambient temperature. Some DPs also run a fresh black shade at the start of every shoot day, particularly for visual effects or green screen work where clean shadows are a non-negotiable. So don't overthink it, just treat black shading as a part of your camera prep. When you change environments or camera settings significantly, just do it. It's a simple process that protects your image integrity and saves you headaches later in post. In the next section, we'll talk about something just as crucial but more physical, media and file structure. I'll walk you through RED's media workflow, what cards to use, and how to manage your RED files and post-production that fits into all of this. When you're working with RED, media management becomes a much more critical part of your workflow, not just because these files are larger, but because they're more powerful. RED's RED format isn't just a video file, it's a container embedded with metadata, compression, and flexibility, and a non-destructive color control. So how you record, backup, and ingest that media matters. Let's break down what media to use, how the files are structured, and how to hand them properly in post. The Komodo X specifically uses CF Express 2.0 Type B cards. You need high-speed CF Express media capable of sustained write speeds to keep up with the REDCODE RAW. If you cheap out here, your camera will drop frames, freeze up, or worse, fail to record altogether. Stick to RED-approved cards or trusted brands like Angelbird, ProGrade, or Lexar, and always check the sustained write speed. Once you've shot your footage, each clip is stored in its own folder. Inside that folder, you'll see several files. The R3D file, this is your raw video file. Everything you shot is inside this. A .rmd sidecar file, which stores the metadata, things like ISO, white balance, that are made in camera. And if you've enabled proxy shooting, you may also see these files in the folder as well, but of course, this is optional. What's important here is that the metadata is separate from the image data. So if you change white balance or apply a LUT in post, it doesn't touch the original RAW file. It just updates the sidecar file, kind of like a Lightroom catalog. That's what gives you the non-destructive flexibility. You can also reset, delete, and export any of the metadata at your point, and your original RAW file stays untouched. Now, there are two main tools for ingesting RED footage: RED Cine X Pro, RED's own software. It's free and gives you full access to adjust the RAW settings and also do some batch export into ProRes, for example. It's the best place to still do initial RAW adjustments, generate dailies, or apply LUT with precision. DaVinci Resolve, which I use, and most people I think use, natively supports the R3D files. You can adjust the raw metadata directly in the media or color pages, and if you're editing and grading in Resolve, this streamlines the entire workflow and keeps you in one ecosystem. If you need to edit on a laptop or send dailies quickly, you can record proxy files in camera alongside the RAW. These are lower resolution, lower bitrate versions of your footage, typically ProRes, and they follow your in-camera LUT settings. You can edit with proxies and then relink back to the REDCODE RAW files later in your Resolve or finishing platform. Just keep in mind proxies are for speed, not for final image quality. So the takeaway here is really simple. Don't mess with the folder structure and build a workflow that respects the RAW flexibility. Red gives you incredible latitude, but only if you handle your media correctly from the start. Next, we'll talk about battery life and power systems because the Komodo X and any Red body becomes a totally different beast depending on how you power it. The Komodo X has a native V-mount battery interface, which means you can power the body directly without needing a third-party plate. Let's walk through what types of batteries are best, what kind of power performance you can expect, and how to properly protect your camera's SDI when using external accessories. Because Komodo X draws more power than its predecessor, especially when recording at high resolutions or using external accessories, battery quality and voltage stability are critical. The camera accepts 14 volt to 34 volt inputs and is designed for high discharge cinema grade batteries. Now, if you're using the 98 watt V-mount batteries, expect about 45 minutes to 60 minutes of runtime. If you're using something like 150 watt, these are better for longer takes and powering accessories, especially from the same source. So here you can expect about 90 minutes, but this all depends on the total system draw. Recommended batteries are the core batteries, which offer stable discharge rates and proper smart battery telemetry. This allows the Komodo X to read the remaining battery life and voltage data directly through the camera, which is really important when operating close to depletion. It's critical to monitor the voltage. You can go to System Power, set a low voltage warning to alert you when a cutoff happens. Always power down the camera and change the batteries. Hot swapping V-mounts is possible through regulated plates or batteries, but the internal power patch should always be stable to avoid media corruption. If you're running a wireless video transmitter, monitor, or lens system, be mindful about the total current draw. When using the DTAP to power accessories, always verify polarity, avoid unregulated cables, and never plug in or remove a DTAP cable while under load unless necessary. DTAP is not hot swappable by design and can cause voltage spikes. Now, let's talk about one of the most important and often overlooked technical considerations when building out a RED rig, SDI Protocol. Under certain conditions, it's possible to damage the Komodo X's SDI port. RED's guidance here is clear and should always be followed. Use only high-quality, shielded SDI cables. Here's the correct SDI connection sequence according to RED. First, connect a power source to the SDI accessory, power on the SDI accessory, ensure the Komodo X is also powered on, then connect the SDI cable, first to the accessory, then to the camera. When detaching, power down the SDI accessory, disconnect the SDI cable from the camera, disconnect the power source from the SDI accessory. Never change batteries on an SDI powered accessory while they are still connected to the Komodo X via the SDI port. Doing so risks undergrounding the voltage to the SDI line, which can result in permanent damage to the camera's SDI port. Disconnect the SDI before any hot swaps and always verify grounding and power stability before reconnecting. Power isn't just about uptime, it's about stability and protecting the integrity of your camera's electronics. Choose reliable batteries, monitor your voltage, and if you're working with SDI accessories, make sure to follow RED's protocol. It's easy to overlook this on set, but a single mistake can take down your output feed for the day, or worse, damage your entire hardware. In the next section, we'll walk through wireless camera control using the RED Control app, how to set it up, what you can control, and when it makes sense to use it on set. One of the most practical features of the Komodo X is its built-in Wi-Fi and Ethernet control, which gives you full wireless access to the camera through the RED Control app. whether via your phone, tablet, or even computer. If you're working on a gimbal, Steadicam, car rig, or even just monitoring from across the room on a commercial set, being able to control the settings and trigger record remotely is incredibly useful. And on the Komodo X, it's built in. No third-party systems required. Komodo X can operate as either a Wi-Fi access point or connect to an existing Wi-Fi network. To enable wireless control, go to Menu, System, Communication, then Network Settings, turn Wi-Fi on, choose between the access point mode, the camera creates its own network, good for quick solo use, client mode, the camera joins an existing Wi-Fi, useful for multi-camera control or when using a wireless video village. Once connected, launch the REDCODE app on your phone or tablet and enter the camera's IP address. If you're on the same network, it should discover automatically. You can now monitor a live video preview, start and stop recording, adjust resolution, frame rate, ISO, white balance, shutter angle. You can also load presets and control playback. Latency is minimum, good enough for framing, not critical enough for focus. But for quick camera control, especially in handheld or remote mounted rigs, REDCODE is incredibly efficient. For more stable, low latency, especially in a studio environment, Komodo X also supports wired camera control over the Ethernet port. This can run into a desktop DIT cart or wireless router for more robust network integration. This setup is more robust, especially on larger sets where Wi-Fi can get congested. You can still access all the controls, metadata, and image previews over a hardwired line. Wireless control is ideal when you can't access the buttons. For example, car builds, Steadicam builds, or any mounted rigs. It's also great as a backup solution. If your SDI does go, or if your camera monitor fails, you still have control access and a rough preview on your phone, which can save you a lot of downtime on set. So whether you're a solo operator or part of a larger crew, REDCODE gives you immediate flexibility without extra gear or setup time. Just make sure your network is stable, your IPA settings are correct, and your firmware is up to date. In the next section, we'll get into autofocus performance, how RED handles lens communication, and when you'll need to build out a full manual focus system, especially when you start adapting cinema lenses. When you're coming from a mirrorless or DSLR background, autofocus is a given these days. With RED, that's not the world that you're entering. The Komodo X uses a locking RF, or more recently since the Nikon acquisition, a Z-mount lens, which is incredibly versatile. But RED's philosophy around autofocus is still very different from hybrid systems. It's not built for subject tracking or face detection. It's designed for professional cinema workflow, where manual focus is still the standard, and for good reason. That said, let's break down what autofocus features on RED does offer, how to adapt your lenses, and when a dedicated focus system becomes essential. Komodo X supports contrast detection autofocus with compatible RF lenses, or now Z-mount lenses. So yes, the autofocus works, but it's slow and it's not built for reactive moments. It's useful for setting focus quickly before a shot or solo operating with an interview, for example. But for anything that requires real-time focus pulls, you'll need a manual solution. The real power of RF mount is the adaptability. Komodo X supports a wide range of professional lens mounts via adapters. For example, I have this RF to PL lens mount adapter. If you're using cinema glass, this is what you want to get. RED also makes their own RF to PL mount with Cook Eye support, which allows lens metadata to be passed through for visual effects and lens mapping purposes. When using manual glass, you'll be pulling focus entirely by hand, which is where a wireless focus system comes in handy. The moment you're using cinema lenses or working with any setup that doesn't support reliable autofocus, a wireless follow focus system becomes critical. For gimbal, Steadicam, or remote work such as a car rig, this is not optional. You won't be able to hit critical focus by touch or guesswork. I'm currently using the DJI Focus Pro, which offers wireless motor control with precise, repeatable focus pulls, autofocus assisted when paired with their LiDAR unit. There are other great options out there too, such as the Tilt Nucleus, Preston, Pterodact RT, but the DJI system has a great price-performance ratio, especially for solo operators or smaller crews. Now, let's talk about using PL lenses, especially on film sets. PL is the standard, and it's what most cinema lenses are built around. Long focus throw, consistent gear spacing, hard stop. They're made for controlled environments where you're not relying on autofocus. And in those environments, you're not pulling focus yourself. That's the job of a first AC. A first AC job is to measure, mark, and pull focus with precision. Now, you can still manually focus with PL lenses, and I do it sometimes when I'm working solo or on a running gun type of shoot. But when you're moving quickly, shooting wide open, or flying a camera on a rig, a follows focus system is necessary. At that point, you're either the operator or the focus puller, and you still need a first AC. But everyone's use case is different. I know shooters who use REDs for weddings, for interviews, for corporate work. You don't need a first AC for everything, but if you're getting into cinema-based workflows, especially if you're using PL lenses, you'll eventually need to build around that reality. RED gives you the image quality and data flexibility, and that's perfect for that kind of work, but autofocus isn't one of its strengths. Coming up, let's talk about rigging out your RED so that it's actually usable on set. From camera cages to monitors, this is where the modular nature of RED starts to make sense. One of the first things you notice when you take out your RED, especially something like the Komodo X, is how stripped down the body is. It's just the essentials: a sensor, a mount, media slot, a few ports, and a not so usable screen. That's intentional. These cameras are designed to be built around your workflow. And building a proper rig is what transformed this box into a production-ready cinema camera. Let's walk through what you actually need to get shooting and why each part of the rig matters. Let's start with the cage. Here I'm using the tilted cage for the Komodo X, but there are other options from wooden camera, small rig, and Condor Blue. You want something that gives you multiple quarter 20 and 3/8 mounting points, cold 2 options, and NATO rails, and even RE rosettes if you're adding handles or accessories. The cage is your foundation. Everything else, power, focus, monitoring, will build off of this. From there, you'll need 15mm rods and a base plate if you're running matte boxes, follow focus motors, or lens support. Next, on monitoring, the built-in screen on the Komodo X is useful for tight setups or when you're flying the camera on a gimbal, but for most shooting scenarios, you'll want at least a 5-inch or 7-inch monitor. I use the small HD Ultra monitor because they offer RED native camera control over their cables. There are other great options like Portkeys, Atomos. You'll also want to think about preview LUTs and monitoring profiles. Load your preferred LUT onto the camera or the monitor so you're previewing your image in a way that reflects your intended final look. This is especially important when shooting RAW, since the native log preview can look very flat without correction. The Komodo X doesn't have built-in NDs, so if you're shooting outdoors or wide open on fast glass, you'll need a matte box with ND filters or a high-quality screw-on variable ND. I personally prefer a matte box with the 4x5 standard NDs inside of a matte box. But for gimbal work, or if you're wanting to shoot lighter, a screw-on variable ND such as one from Polar Pro or Typhon could do the job. So how you build your RED depends on what you're shooting. For documentary or travel work, you might want to keep a little bit more lean, a top handle, a V-mount, and a single monitor. But for commercial and narrative work, you're probably building it out with rods, a matte box, follow focus, timecode sync. The beauty of RED is that you can scale up or down depending on the job. But what matters most is this: your rig needs to be comfortable, reliable, and shoot ready. Every accessory should serve a purpose. Nothing should be there just because. If you've never shot on RED before, there's a learning curve, and that's fine. It's part of why you're watching this video. But there are some common mistakes that pop up again and again with new users, and most of them come down to either misunderstanding how RED works or skipping critical prep steps. Let's go through a few that are easy to avoid once you kind of know what to look for. The first big one is treating ISO like exposure gain. Remember, RED shoots RAW. ISO isn't actually affecting the sensor exposure, it's the metadata. What you're doing when you adjust ISO is shifting the way the image preview is rendered and how the middle gray is displayed. So if you shoot a scene at ISO 3200, you're not adding noise in the traditional sense, you're lifting the image digitally in post. That changes where the clip highlights and where the shadows start to fall apart. It's not wrong to change ISO, just understand what it's really doing. Next is relying too much on the built-in LCD or the LUT. That screen is useful, but it's not accurate, especially in bright sunlight or when viewing log footage without a conversion LUT. Make sure you know what LUT you're using and whether it's affecting your SDI output, your onboard display, or even your proxies. If your footage looks wrong in post, it's usually not a camera issue, it's a monitoring one. Another common mistake is not using your exposure tools. If you're exposing purely by feel or eyeballing the LCD, you're playing with fire. Goalposts and traffic lights exist for a reason. Use them. If you're blowing highlights or crushing shadows and don't notice after the fact, it's almost always because the exposure tools were ignored. A big one, especially for new RED users, is forgetting to black shade. We covered this earlier, but it's worth repeating. If you've changed temperature conditions, done a firmware update, or noticing some artifacts in your shadows, you need to recalibrate the sensor. It only takes a few minutes. Skipping this leads to a degraded image quality, and it's not something you can fix in post. Then there's also media handling. RED footage is stable as long as you don't break the file structure. If you're copying just the .r3d files and leaving behind the other folders or sidecars, you're gonna have problems down the line. Always back up the full folder hierarchy as it exists on the card. And finally, not planning for power. Komodo X does not like to be shut off abruptly. If your battery dies mid-record, you can lose the clips or damage the file system. Always use batteries with proper telemetry and power down the camera manually before swapping batteries. This especially applies when you're using the SDI port. If you unplug a monitor or transmitter without properly following the RED protocol, you can fry the SDI port, and that's expensive to fix. So those are just some common mistakes, and they're all avoidable. What really comes down to is make sure you're treating your RED as a cinema camera. It's not built for the automation process. It gives you total control, but it expects you to know how to use it. If you take your time, test your workflow, and understand your tools, RED becomes incredibly reliable, but you can't fake it. It will expose bad habits fast. Now, in the final section, I'll wrap things up with a few closing thoughts and quick recap of what you should know as you're walking away and just getting started with your RED in 2025. The truth is, this camera, when new, can feel intimidating. It's not meant to be an autofocus and auto system. But that's the point. It's designed for people who want to shoot with intention, who want full control over how the image is captured, and who want the image to hold up under color grading and delivery even years down the line. You now know a little bit about how to set up your RED, how to navigate the menus, how to monitor exposure using tools such as goalposts and traffic lights, how to maintain the sensor with black shading. You've now seen how REDCODE RAW works, how to manage that data, how to power safely, how to rig your camera for the way you want to shoot. We've also covered what RED isn't. It's not built for autofocus. It's not going to track faces and exposure on itself. If you're working in a cinema, such as commercial, narrative, or doc work, you want the most flexibility possible, and this camera gives you that. Whether you're a solo shooter rigging your Komodo X for handheld work or stepping onto set with an entire crew, this camera can scale. But how much value you get out of it depends how much you put into learning it. So take the time to test your workflow. Practice black shading, learn the menus, learn how different compression ratios behave. Build out a kit that supports you and not just how it looks online. RED gives you the tools, but it's your job to use them well. If this video helped you get started, or if you want a deeper breakdown of any specific topic, leave a comment. I'll be building out more RED-focused content over the next few months, and your feedback will help shape what comes next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.